Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming to join us in our discussion about historical and contemporary influences on sculpture. So without further ado, let me introduce you. Sadly, Owen Hopkins couldn't make it to the talk. He's unfortunately sick. So we, have the lovely Dr. Holly Trusted here. Thank you so much for coming along. Just to give a bit of a background on Holly, on Holly's kind of career, a graduate from Cambridge University and the Courtauld Institute of Art. She's a senior curator of sculpture at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where she has been based since 1979. She specializes in British and Spanish sculpture, and recently completed a catalogue of the Baroque and later ivories in the V&A, which was published in November 2013. And one of the other catalogues she completed was on British sculpture, also in the V&A, which was written jointly with Diane Ridley, which was also published back in 2002. She worked on the renovation of the Italian cast court at the V&A, and which opened in November 2014, and is currently preparing a book on German Baroque and Rococo sculpture. So hopefully that could kind of somehow find its way into our discussion today. And of course, a quick kind of background on Shan's career and Shan's involvement in the arts, I guess, Shan's practice. He's graduate from Slade, MFA, sorry I'm reading, it usually kind of helps me concentrate, and is currently enrolled in the PhD program. His BFA was completed at the Seoul National University, which is something I think we could kind of bring into our discussion later on. Over the past 7 years, Shan has been awarded a number of times, including the Royal British Society of Sculptors Bursary Award in 2013, Art Catlin, Open West, and the Oriel Davis opened in 2012. And he took part in a residency based around Kurt Schwittersmer's barn. He was also commissioned by the Arts Council for a new column for Manchester, permanent public installation up in Manchester, as well as the Berkeley House on Berkeley Square back in 2013, called the Berkeley Tree. And alongside private collections in the UK, Netherlands, and South Korea, Shan is also part of the British government art collection. So I guess to start off, I don't know how you'd like to kind of, if you'd want to kickstart what we were discussing earlier in terms of, I guess your influences. Let's take it, to the very beginning. Where it all started from.
My practice.
Exactly.
Okay. The starting point of my practice is kind of misunderstood in my past experience. I visited some gallery space, and there was a construction site near the entrance. And I thought there was kind of art installation, and I enjoyed it quite a long time. But later, some workers came from the hall, and he said, stay away from my way. So I was a bit embarrassed because I thought I was a bit stupid, because I thought the real thing was art installation. But later, I thought I can make it as my own work. So that was the starting point of my practice. So it's
the kind of the construction site, or
yeah, construction
the outdoor, yeah.
Yeah, and looking back, I was aware of the art movement in 60s in America, minimalist and some land artists who think the place is very important. That's why I misunderstood the actual thing is art installation. So I think such artists like Carl Andre, his work is quite influenced to my work in terms of placement, and he made his work as a place itself. So their notion is quite much affected my practice, I think. And then 7 years I developed my practice related with the architecture. So I think the subject of today is historical effect, sculptural effect to my practice. So I can find the relations between my practice and 60s American artists. I think that is kind of basement of my practice.
I guess this kind of historical influences and the historical idea of or sculpture versus an installation, which you just mentioned, or seeing sculpture as an installational piece, which is very much what you're addressing in your practice. It is an intervention in the space to a certain degree. It is very much looking at the space forming a part of the presentation of the sculptural piece, if that makes sense. Wholly, I guess what would be interesting to know is kind of, again, the historical background, if space really kind of, back in with your kind of specialized, I guess, point of view, how that, if at all, would play a role in sculpture, if, we can draw a parallel.
I think lots of interesting ideas occurred to me when you were speaking, but also looking at your works. I personally, as you say, I have a historical perspective, and personally, if it's not too provocative, I find it very disturbing and not very good that you can confuse something that isn't a work of art at all, like a building site, with a work of art. I don't think that's a very good, healthy sign. I think works of art are works of art. And again, I'm taking the fuddy-duddy approach, I know, but that's how I feel. Now, I feel Shan's works are quite clearly works of art. And of course, they're very contemporary. I'm not suggesting they're old-fashioned. But you can see they're works of art. Nobody's going to confuse them as a building site. And I'm very pleased about that, because I think art is artfulness, and I think we were talking informally before about, if you look back not too far, not too long ago, to Rodin and Brancusi, and I would say Barbara Hepworth is another person who your works make me think of. In other words, this in a sense, digging archaeologically, I think there is a sense of that, and the place, as you say, the idea of suggesting a place, whether it's an emotional place or a geographical place, but you also are doing something that is also timeless. Of course, that's the other thing about a great work of art. It has a resonance which isn't necessarily rooted in a place. It's got all sorts of perhaps meanings for people which aren't associated with Britain or with Korea or with, I don't know, ancient Greece. So I think these are very, very interesting questions, and I think, as we all know with works of art, there's a trajectory, there's all sorts of ways you can look back to works of the past, but you can also see how somebody is going further and just doing something slightly different, and that's what I think you seem to be doing.
Yeah, I think I quite like the Carl Andre's work, the equivalent, the plate.
Yes, the metal plate, yeah.
I quite like it because I can step on it.
Yeah.
And he said about his work, he said, I like the works invisible before people looking for. So.
Well, the other thing about Carl Andre, I remember, I mean, I'm not an expert on Carl Andre, but one of the things is that he loved Stonehenge. When he came to Britain, he loved Stonehenge. I think that's quite interesting. So he loved something that had, again, this enormous resonance and visual power. which indeed you would. Well, whether you call it a work of art, it's a monument, isn't it? And you could argue that Carl Andre's most meaningful works are sort of, they have a monumentality. They have a, once you, yes, you're right, you step on them maybe, or you think, but actually they do have a presence. I think that's the important thing.
He said always, there is nothing behind his work. It's just as it is. It's just itself. I think sculpture is about the real things. Sculptors make real things with real things.
Yeah.
So that's
the materiality.
Yes, that's very important.
And in a very profound sense, what you might say in a sort of an American phrase is it is what it is. And in a profound sense, I think that is true. You know, the work of art basically is you can find out about it and you can talk to the artist and find out how it's made. That's all very, very interesting. But it's got to have a power, which is there, as well as all the argument you can find out about it. It's got to have that.
That's very interesting. That the sculpture is still the most powerful medium in this digital images era. Still, it's very powerful because it's real thing, and I think it's the attitude toward the sculpture is very different to the image or the digital illusions nowadays we experience very much.
I mean, in terms of going back to the materiality aspect of it, how important does, do the materials play a role in the concrete sculptures or in any of the bronze pieces upstairs, the found objects, from that perspective?
I quite like concrete. Actually,
we can kind of see that.
Le Corbusier's the architecture. He made 5 principles for new architecture. The first thing is pilotis. Pilotis means pillars, and reinforced concrete pillars. It makes the modern architecture free, for example, free facade or free decorations and on the roof gardens, etc. So he used concrete, very popular, and it is very important material in modern architecture, and it became international style. And it's in 60s, 70s, 80s in Asia. Actually, the cities followed the international style. So I lived in that buildings, and these works are the process of how I myself respond to modern architecture space, I think. Somehow, for example, I always saying my scar on my eye, so I can see some lines when I see empty space. So it looks like some my waterproof, the mark only I can see. So the crack is related with my my personal experience.
It's interesting, isn't it, that concrete, you could argue, isn't a beautiful material in its own right. It's a very humble material. It's a very everyday material. Whereas bronze, which you also use, is again historically has a sort of nobility that we associate with Roman statues that come down from Rome and Greece. But concrete is much more. It's very modern and it's very. It's got a different texture. It's got a different feel. I don't know. Do you feel it's a neutral? You don't feel that's an issue. You feel it's just a means to an end. I mean, obviously it has memories for you, but do you feel it's? I mean, are you almost enjoying the fact that it's not a noble material? That it isn't
very low and raw as well.
Yeah.
So, and actually, this is pebbles and it's
just like found
Later,
objects.
yes.
Yes. So you're transmogrifying them. You're making them into a work of art from very simple materials. Yeah. And in a way, is that part of what you're consciously doing? Consciously sort of elevating them through art. Yeah.
Yes, this kind of process, the bronze pieces actually, from the raw materials to bronze is, I don't know, I want to ask you, bronze is, I feel personally bronze is a bit expensive to make it, and I feel it's a bit high material.
Yeah, absolutely. Bronze is right up there, isn't it? Really, yeah.
But nowadays, many artists try to make their work to bronze piece. For example, Sarah Lucas last time in Whitechapel, she made her stocking pieces to bronze actually. So I think this.
I mean, the other thing is, of course, the question of permanence, because bronze maybe, I mean, ultimately, is more permanent. I mean, it can last thousands of years. I know it doesn't always, but I mean, it can. It's a very permanent material.
But then wouldn't you say concrete and, has a kind of...
I think that's a sort of a paradox, isn't it? Because concrete looks as if it isn't permanent. I mean, it may be permanent, but it hasn't got that same... It's got a sense of instability about it. That's my view. But I mean, maybe that's actually not correct, but you don't feel that concrete... And you do feel your works, many of them, have a deliberately archaeological feel, as if somebody's digging down, tunneling to find the real work. And actually the concrete is simply if you like, a tunnel into that. It's not the work itself. There's a sort of paradox there, in my view.
That's the thing. I guess it's the cyclical nature of of your work or the kind of concept behind your work. This idea of, again, going back to the construction site, the idea that there has been a different building on that same site as there is today, and tomorrow there'll be something else, and it's this kind of depicting that, I guess, again, cycle that it's very much can be referenced to life in general, right? Which is kind of this almost Buddhist approach, and it's these various, I guess, threads of meaning you have behind the something else.
The sense of time. The sense of time.
Time is very important element to sculptors, I think. Sculptors deal in space and time and origin and patterns. That's kind of very important.
And what was it?
Patterns. Yeah. So.
Do you think, I mean, one of the things I've noticed here in this exhibition, there are no titles by the works, and I mean, do you deliberately almost not want to give, I mean, I'm making this up, but not to call this My Memories of Korea, or some title that would immediately give it a sort of a sort of meaning, which the viewer could say, that's that, and try to work out why you've given it that title. Have you sort of divorced the sculptures from? I mean, maybe they do have titles, but you don't want the title to be dictating how the viewer looks at them.
Yeah.
Is that right?
If I write title here, it ruins the work.
Yeah, because it sort of dilutes the work almost. Yeah. It makes the person then read the title and then instead of looking and responding.
And
but then,
also, I was curious about the questioning about individuality, I think. I was wondering who I am and how can I call myself me? That's I'm looking for in the space, maybe during the interaction with space, or skies, but that's, I think it will be questioning about the individuality. What is the individual?
But the individual artist or the individual work of art, or both?
Individuality itself, I think.
Of
How can I call myself me? That's the big question I have.
and so do you give a work a title, if you like, you know, in the archives, but not on the wall? I mean, do you yourself think that this work, for example, has a title, or does it have no title?
It has title.
It does have a title. Are we allowed to know what the title is, or is it a secret?
This one is forgotten.
Forgotten?
Yeah, forgotten.
Oh, right. Because immediately a title, especially a title like that, immediately it gives you all sorts of associations, you know, you start thinking why and what does that mean and how does it relate to your life. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it?
I guess also part of the curation, kind of the curatorial aspect of generally setting up Shan's exhibition and your vision that you were talking about earlier as well. It's very much to do with this interaction with the space. And what I absolutely loved when you said earlier, Shan, how the space in itself, whether it's the gallery, whether it's that same construction site that I keep on referring to, or any other kind of space that you know, outside or indoors, external or indoor space, how it dictates a certain movement of people. So if someone would walk into that space, they have a certain kind of calculated way around that space that the space itself sets, if that makes sense. So therefore, with these installations, which are site-specific, which are sculptural, they were positioned specifically without the titles to kind of, on the one hand, I guess, not necessarily intrude or interfere with the space, but I guess complement it, and at the same time, stick true to, I guess, this natural path of the audience,
Do you ever change your titles? I mean, supposing you put something here, and it therefore maybe had a different meaning for you, would you change the title, or does the title remain the same?
If the work outside,
I mean, supposing this one that you
space.
called Forgotten, supposing once you had it installed, you thought, no, I'm
but this
not
one,
happy.
the Forgotten is a bit exceptional case.
Uh-huh.
I don't title the work because these ones are just broken pillar.
All right.
Yeah.
So many of them simply just are, if you like, descriptive.
Yeah.
They're not. They don't have an emotional title.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Broken pillar or hole on the wall.
Yeah.
Or crack on the wall like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it
breaks.
It's almost our job to bring, if we want to bring an emotional feeling to it, we bring it. You don't necessarily tell us what the emotion is. Do you think your works are emotional? Or do you think, or don't you kind of see them like that? I mean, do they have...
I don't think my work expression the emotional,
No.
especially. I think it's a bit dry. Like
They're
concrete.
intellectual. But I don't know, I suppose again I'm bringing my own views to this, but in one sense you could say with works that suggest archaeology and history, they suggest that digging down, and the works of art that seem to be buried, half buried, there's a suggestion of sadness, actually, elegy, isn't there? There's a suggestion of the passage of time and human civilizations being buried and rediscovered. I don't know. I don't know if that's so. So there is emotion there, even if it isn't a particular sort of narrative. It's just that it it can evoke, and actually I think works of art should, in a very, sometimes very sublimated way, there's feelings there. It isn't, after all, this is made by a human being. I mean, we're human beings, so we have feelings and we have, memories and so on. So I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, on the other hand, I return to what you said before. It is what it is. I mean, the work of art is simply presented, and you don't need to have a story, an emotion.
Or less so than I presume you used to, a while back. With
Yes,
kind
I
of
mean, if you look, let's say,
contemporary
the 18th century, where of course, the whole context was often very different. You had a work of art that maybe was religious, and therefore, of course, it had to have a story, an emotion. I mean, it had a certain function, and even you could argue a portrait bust has has an emotion for the people who knew the person, or maybe it commemorates somebody, or there's all sorts of it is different. But I would actually sort of double back from that and say that the works of art that we truly value.
How do you think the Rodin's broken nose bust? I quite like that piece actually.
Yes, it's wonderful. Yes, well, Rodin. You see, I think Rodin was a very interesting artist because his work, as you know, he was born in 1840. He died in 1917. So right, late 19th century, the early 20th century, and his work, some of his work is very clearly 19th century. It's very clearly in the tradition of other French sculptors, Cabet, Deleuze, and Dalou, people like that. But of course, the reason I think he's very popular today, and very much a famous artist with lots and lots of people, is that he sort of initiated the idea of, he initiated the idea of the fragment, he initiated the idea of a work of art, a sculpture that is just a sculpture, that doesn't have it isn't pretty, it isn't necessarily out to persuade anybody of anything, and it just is a sculpture. And I think Rodin was one of the very first people to do that. So I think The Man with the Broken Nose, obviously in one sense it's a kind of a portrait, and it's very realistic, but it's also the texture and the sense that it isn't quite finished. There's a real sense of it as an object, and I think even the earlier works of art, the 18th century Renaissance works of art, ultimately the ones that we still keep going back to, that we're very taken with, it's because they again have this sort of presence which is transcending what the actual meaning might be. I mean, the meaning is still there, very important, but you go back to, let's say, Donatello's Mary Magdalene, not because it's Mary Magdalene, but because the way he's carved the wood is so extraordinary, and you want to look and sort of see that texture and the way he's made that sculpture. So I think it isn't a cut-off, there isn't a division, it's just that there are different emphases.
And I guess that the interesting element of it all is that kind of, almost hands touch, the artist's touch of the work, which nowadays less and less so. I mean, we're talking about foundries and fabrications, which again has existed.
Absolutely. And the artist workshop with a team of people working, which, as you say, but still there is this sense, and again, I still think it's very valid, the great artists, there is something that they, there is a spark that is whether, even if they did rely on people with a foundry, or even sometimes, I mean, Rodin had people carve marble for him. He wasn't, he did need a team of people to help him, but he had the idea, and he also made sure they were finished in the way he wanted them finished. So there's all sorts of different. But presumably you do, you have a foundry, do you? Foundry?
Yeah, I have a foundry, and I don't make whole process of the work.
No,
just
you can't.
It's
So
all cooperation with one artist
they have
or production companies, and I think artist role is a bit different with modern artists like Rodin.
Yeah. Well, it depends how much work you want to produce. I think somebody at Rodin was being very, very productive. So he needed his big workshop to produce many sculptures. So that's another issue. And I think again, maybe today, the way the art market works. I mean, art galleries. Here we are in an art gallery, and of course, art galleries have existed since the 19th century. But again, the way people present and exhibit their work, that's another question. And their works of art, again, I think there's been a shift that now, which you could argue again, Rodin was partly part of this movement of a work of art is appreciated in its own right as a work of art, and people have works of art in their domestic interiors or whatever, and of course in museums and art galleries, but they're seen as very exceptional, beautiful objects which you see in their own right. They don't have to be in a church, and they don't have to be a portrait, and they don't have to, I mean, they have a context, but they're valued very much for the act of creation. They're valued because they've been created by somebody, and that's why we want to look at them. So there's all sorts of interesting ways slowly in the 20th, 21st century we perhaps slightly, changed our ways of looking at art.
Which I guess again brings back to the point you were making about individuality and how important it is in your work, and of kind of extracting each sculpture, be it again in a site-specific installation format or in a sculptural piece on its own, but it's kind of looking at that almost kind of outside, I guess, the space, as well as interacting with the space. Again, like I keep on going back to I guess the relevance and the importance of space in your work, and how you kind of see it develop, or the influences that kind of you come across, I guess. This element of individuality. I guess kind of
what is
what is the question? What are you saying? To be more specific. No, I'm just drawing it back to.
Another thing I want to say is actually my work is a bit different when it is outside and in the gallery space. And I actually installed my broken pillar in front of Gloucester University, and the next day actually the student called to university, maybe 30 students called to university, and they said your pillar is broken, and the officers in the university surprised called to emergency service. So actually emergency service came to the site and take the emergency tape all around. So I think that's a bit very different effect depending on the site. And actually I quite like to install my work in the street or something outside. It's more exciting.
And people can then come across it and discover it and enjoy it in a way that perhaps when we go specifically to a museum or to an exhibition, we sort of have a different mindset, don't we? We're perhaps not as open and relaxed as if we just see something and just start enjoying it just without any strings attached.
Also, I quite like the notion to make outdoor space as art gallery itself.
Yeah.
I quite like to change the mundane experience to art experience. That's kind of purpose.
One of the great pleasures, I think, for people who like sculpture is to go to Henry Moore's house at Much Haddon, where his sculptures are there with the sheep, with the trees, with the grass, and it's really wonderful to see. It isn't a sculpture park in a sort of self-conscious way. It's just he's put his sculptures outdoors because that's how he wanted them. And I think that's, of course, a rural setting, and it's, of course, his house and his sculpture, so it's very much sort of egocentric, really. But nevertheless, it works beautifully, and so you do, and of course you do have sculpture parks like the sculpture park in Yorkshire, which are, I think, sometimes very, very successful. But again, they're sort of a bit, they're a little bit self-conscious, aren't they? We go to the sculpture park and we prepare ourselves mentally to go to the sculpture park.
Don't you find there's a need, to a certain degree, of this kind of formality for sculpture parks to have that kind of formal approach, or this interaction to a certain degree to I guess counterbalance this intervention, this type of kind of contemporary intervention within outdoor indoor space, that kind of blurred line between the two, I guess, that is quite fastly and rapidly developing now, right?
Yeah. Well, and of course you do get in an urban setting like London, you get all sorts of sculptures outdoors, and obviously even in the 19th century you have, or earlier, you have King Charles I in Whitehall, and you have Nelson's column, obviously, and you have all sorts of sculptures in an urban setting. But generally, the sculpture of the 19th century before is very much commemorative. We're seeing it because it is who it is, rather than. But then in the 20th century, you have Henry Moore and all sorts of sculptures in the city. But it should be.
I think so. I think so. Any questions, comments?
Sorry, my question is, from the moment you have an idea of a piece of work, what's the journey from the idea to the wall? So how does it arrive on the wall? When you think of an idea, how does it travel to the wall? How does it get there?
It's very important to see the flow map to me. So I should expect people's movement, and I imagine how people see, and it is very a bit calculated and engineered process. I think I expect their responses, and normally if I have some ideas, the process is for making it just like first ideas. Its ideas does not change much from the first idea to the end of journey, I think.
Do you start with the drawing?
Yes, drawing is very important methodology to me, because I always make a drawings with my hand when I make new work. It's very important process. I think it's helpful to make new things and to draw the process. So I quite like drawing. I usually use 1 or 2 books for one exhibition, for plannings and making the process.
Thank you, that's good to know.
I've got a question. Holly, it's a question for you, really, Holly. I think it sort of seems a lot like Shan's work is very site-specific, and I wonder what that sort of history is about, and what the challenges are as a museum to somehow maintain that sort of site specificity about artworks. I'm thinking about the Greek marbles, for example, removing that from a specific place, and what those challenges are for museums and how you preserve those works.
It's an ongoing challenge, because I would say in the sculpture collection at the V&A, 99% of the sculptures were not made for a museum. They were made perhaps for a church, perhaps perhaps for somebody's house, sometimes for a garden, and in one sense, well, in one sense, the visitors, if you like, are very, people have an expectation. They know they're coming to a museum. They know they're seeing works which aren't where they were made for. They've been moved. So, in one sense, you could argue, ever since museums began in the, 16th century, in one sense, that's the magic of a museum. Wow, there's this stuff here that suddenly come here and I can look at it. I don't have to go to Korea or South America. It's here. I mean, I'm not, of course, advocating that we go all over the world and just grab things, and it's not like that. But as you know, Neil MacGregor at the British Museum, this is a world museum. This is incredible. We can learn about the world, and that's one of the reasons a museum is a great place, because we are able to learn about all sorts of works of art from all sorts of different cultures, and I think it's a very valuable thing. Now, with the sculpture at the V&A, the European sculpture, as I say, to some extent, people say, okay, I realise this is not the right context in one sense, but in another way, what we do is we, without making it a theme park, we try to evoke certain things. So if it is religious Christian sculpture, then there will be, I hope, a certain sense of, let's say, solemnity. There's a sense of grouping things in such a way, the lighting. I don't, as I say, not pretending it's church, but just so that, and of course you tell people things about sculpture, that tells them, look, this is actually part of an altarpiece, and the rest of it has got destroyed, and the church has since been demolished, and this is why it's here. So you're telling people things, and I'm a great believer that museums they're lots of fun, and they're very beautiful and glamorous, but they also are educational. We're learning things all the time, and I think that's what I'd say. Having said that, as you know, there's nothing so exciting as going, I say, to a church in, France, Italy, wherever, and walking in, and there is, let's say, a wonderful tomb that has been there for hundreds of years and has a wonderful sense of why it was made, and here it is, and you can see it, and this is what the artist saw when he made it. So these things just, there's always, they're not exactly fighting each other, but there's different ways of looking at art, and there's different contexts, and you just, I think, have to prime yourself up for whatever wherever you're going. But it's something, when you're doing an installation in a museum, you're very, very conscious of how to sort of suggest things sometimes.
Hello. I thought it was really interesting, your first statement, which you said was provocative. You knew the difference between a sculpture and a building site. I think I've got you right there. I think one of the most interesting building sites I've been to is Pompeii, and the excavations of the figures of people who were fleeing the eruptions, which have been which left holes and been cast into plasters. And I mean, I think they're extraordinary objects, whether they're sculptures or not. Maybe you'd like to expand a bit on that. I mean, I would suspect that quite a few objects in the V&A were made not in mind as sculptures, but the original makers were thinking about sculpture.
Well, lots of questions there. I mean, the plasters at Pompeii, as you know, they were made, I think, made in the 19th century, I think. They were made as copies of, as you say, the people who were fleeing the volcano.
Well, they were made as casts.
Yeah, they're plaster casts.
The original figures.
They're plaster casts. You're right in one sense, and again, I don't want to be an ancient archaeological site and the plaster and so on. There's then a sort of blurring of what is a work of art, and you could argue, you know, talking about religious works of art, you could argue that religious sculptures and you know, you could say, well, wait a minute, they were made primarily for devotional purposes. They weren't made for people to go and admire the way that they've been carved. They were made because it was the Virgin enshrined, and that was the important thing. So I suppose my provocative comment was that I find in contemporary music and contemporary classical music and contemporary visual arts, again, I'm just speaking entirely for myself, I don't want to imply this is an official pronouncement, I get very irritated by things which it's unclear whether it's a work of art or not. You know, sometimes deliberately so, you know, that it has no form or no artifice. Now maybe that's my ignorance, maybe I'd learned to understand, but I suspect I'm not going to get there. So I suppose that the building site versus a work of art. I mean, after all, we could go out of these doors. We could look at all sorts of things that we could get tremendous pleasure from, aesthetic pleasure, but they're not works of art. And I do actually think we do need to be a little bit more disciplined and not say everything is a work of art.
Isn't what Shan's doing in this exhibition, particularly down here, with these quite aggressive digging into the wall, in a sense pointing that out, that if he says it's a work of art, and he's created this installation, this intervention in this building, so that as you walk by, you're drawn into this specific space. He's actually he's turned the ordinary into the extraordinary by saying, that's what I want you to look at.
We're going back to Marcel Duchamp,
Yeah.
Urinal, and you know, that was the first time anybody had presented something that was, and just said, right, I'm going to call it a work of art, and therefore it's a work of art. I actually think Shan's work is slightly different from that, because I think, looking at anything, any of these, you would realise there was again, artifice. There was some conscious process going on, and again, ultimately, ultimately we all come back to subjectivity. I mean, and ultimately you can argue till you're blue in the face. I think this is different from something that is, you know, that is. Again, I don't want to get personal about this, but I've been to certain installations where I really don't think anybody would have known that these were works of art. I think it's, you know, it's personally, it's not something I'm very good at understanding. But I just put it like that.
Sir, and what do you think yourself? Is this work of art?
I just think it's interesting the way that Shan has made what, in another context, might not seem to be a work of art into a work of art. And there are various things he's done here. You know, one is that he's secreted objects behind the digging, which, you know, the digging actually focuses you on their vulnerability, their specific sort of nature. Also, he's centred the pieces in the walls. They're not, you know, they're not sort of on corners and things like that. He's also put spotlights on them. So there's a various series of things that he's done here to make us think that they're works of art, and to convince us of his conviction that they're works of art. There's this kind of interesting dialogue between what is just basically rubble and the work of art that you started off talking about, you know, the artifice.
Yeah, sorry,
I
think one of the things which, you know, I agree with all that you've said. I think one of the things that is also interesting, and you could say it through Carlandre as well, is that you have to look at a body of work. I mean, I'm not saying you have to look at every single thing you've ever made, but the point is somebody is developing a language, and you, if you like what they're doing, you start to get used to their language and their grammar, and you start to say, oh yes, oh, I can see this is an ongoing recurrent sort of theme, and I think that is entirely valid, actually. I think that's quite an interesting, so I think, you know, as we're here in this space, we can see things keep on coming up, variations. It's not that they're repetitive, but that you're addressing related themes, and that is, again, one of the reasons they're works of art. They're not accidents. They're not, it's just, you know, it's not just that there happens to be a broken column. It's part of a much bigger sort of range of things. Right. Sorry.
Yes, I think we're hinting at something now that is actually interesting, and more interesting than the question whether something is a work of art or not. I think we're living in a day and age where, you know, anything can be a work of art. It just depends on the context. So much more interesting to me would be to find out what are the criteria for good art as opposed to not so good art, or even very good art, especially in the context of contemporary sculpture.
So I'm not sure my word is fit this argument, but I think I can imagine the first time the Bauhaus made in 1990. Maybe it was first time to make scared space like that, and very weird people live there together, and other people think they are very weird. Weird people live weird space, they thought like that. But after that, naturally became international style and spread and changed the world a little bit. So I think it can be a bit weird at the first time, but and your question is, I think, is how we can judge art or not. In my personal opinion as an artist, I think art is the edge of the line, so questioning this is art or not, to make a question to audience, that's the important thing as a contemporary artist. I think that's the role of the artist. Sometimes it's successful, but sometimes it fails. And I don't know, but I think that's my personal opinion about that.
Well, another way of approaching that is to say, well, we can be subjective about whether it's a good work of art, but maybe another way of thinking about it is that it's an interesting work of art. I mean, for instance, I find these two pieces more interesting than the works upstairs, because the works upstairs are part of a tradition of art, of bronze and art. And although they're beautiful and they're very likable, I find these pieces down here much more interesting, because they, I think in a way, they are provoking a much more interesting debate about architecture, destruction, discovery of something, which to me is just much more interesting. And also the fact that you persuaded this gallery to let you hack away at their walls. Jesus Christ, I mean, this is £1 million gallery, and you're able to, you know, they said, go ahead, get a drill and drill into that. That's fantastic.
It was absolutely worth it every single time.
Yeah, and I admire the gallery for letting you do it. And in a sense, that actually has made the whole experience of coming to this space so much more exciting because of that.
Yes, the authorities is kind of an interesting element of my work, because when I made it first time, many people came to me, you are in trouble, you can't break the building, you will be in trouble. So, and I had to ask to the landlord or who had the authorities to do my practice, to negotiate to them, and communication, and persuade to them why this is worth to do. And that's the kind of important process of my practice, and I quite like the conversations. And that's a bit different ways of work with another studio-based artist, I think, because my work is planned at the place and made at the place and is finished on the place. So there's differences, I think.
Tiny question. Did you have to compromise the scale of the intervention because of the landlord? In a world without landlords, would you have made a different intervention, or is it exactly as you had intended it? Sorry.
Did you have to make it
Smaller
less major? Did the landlord say you can only do this if you make it small enough, or something like that?
There was no like that landlord before. Just they wanted to put some objects they like, so they suggest some objects they like, and yeah, sometimes when I made my broken pillar in Manchester, I worked with a football museum in Manchester, and we discussed a lot about objects, and it was decided through the conversation, I think, not only my choice. I think that's a bit different with artists.
So there was an element of compromise, but it was a sort of good humoured. It was you came to an agreement.
Yes.
At the risk of sounding pedestrian in light of previous questions, I'm just wondering if the door in your wall leads to anything. Are you, I mean, picking up on what Holly was saying about archaeology and digging within sculpture, are you digging to find anything in particular?
The door, do you mean?
Yeah.
That piece is my favorite piece in this show.
What are you hoping to expose?
But it's a little bit high. This I quite like. It's because, as I said, Carl Andres said he likes the words invisible before viewers looking for. I quite like that as well. So I hope it's become meaningful when viewers recognize it as an art. And I quite like the way of making it because the treating the wood is totally different with concrete because wood is kind of life. So I think there is a humble attitude to carving the wood. So I don't know. That's my favorite work.
So it's the element of discovery, I guess.
Yes.
That's kind of the main intention there. But once the audience, once the viewer does discover that there is a door there, is there a continuation? What's in your mind, kind of if the door were to be open? What's on the other side? Or you'd want to leave it up to the audience too?
Because I follow the shape of the door, actual door in the church, Berkshire Church. Actually, the door was discovered in Berkshire Church 2 years ago. And I actually imagine when 18th centuries monks opened the door for lighting or ventilating the space. During the process of making, I imagine the mood at the time and church, monks, and the light. And I think the notion of the light is totally different in this era and 18th century. And the comparison is interesting as well. So, I hope it evokes some imagination to viewers as
Any more questions, comments? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming again. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Shan, for your time as well.